Is there anybody here who was at a workshop that Tom and I did at the last Oakland event? Okay, well, this is some new material. I suddenly had this feeling a while ago that I had to prepare everything absolutely novel because of you, this one person, because I didn't want to disappoint him. And of course, the psychedelic world has transformed. So we have moved from, as Rick Dobbin said many years ago, we're not the counterculture, we're the culture. And we're coming along just in time. So there is a schedule, which we know, and there will be a break at around 10:30 or 10:45. There'll be another break in the afternoon, and lunch will be 12:30 to 2. Tom and I will simply alternate presentations, and we will have a discussion either after each presentation or after a set of presentations. And the discussion is because there are so many of you who are honestly so impressive, and we're really all trying to work this out. This is not, nothing in the psychedelic world at the moment is set. It's all fluid and it's all in motion, and you're the reason that it's going to move forward. So, Tom and I have been friends longer than we probably want to admit, and the thing that I'm most interested whenever Tom presents is he has a bigger picture than I ever do, as well as he has a lot better PowerPoints. So, we're going to try to keep to a tight schedule, and I've asked the staff to help us when it's 5 minutes before any of us need to do anything. They're going to flash us a sign. I don't even want to ask you for questions because you might have some. Okay. So we're going to start. What you read in your program is close to what we're going to do. We were asked to write that some months ago, and as I said, things have changed en route, especially with everything I'm presenting. But it's too late for you to get into another workshop. And when people ask you how this one was, just say, it was really great, you should have been there, and don't worry about it, even if that's not true. Okay, so my distinguished friend and one of the few human beings who has ever invented an international holiday out of his own head and found that it was picked up and it is now, as you know, celebrated in an amazing number of places in an awfully lot of interesting ways. Tom Roberts.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I want to start off by giving a book away. Tuesday afternoon, I received an advance copy of a book that's coming out, or maybe it's out by now, called appropriately One Toke to God. Okay, and they sent me a bunch of them as a contributor, and I had to give one away. And I decided the way to do it is anybody's birthday here bicycle day that is yesterday? Nobody? Nobody's? How about people whose birthday is today? Oh, come on. Did you all just descend out of mushrooms? How about tomorrow? That's amazing. We ought to get an astrologer in here. How about Sunday? Anybody's birthday Sunday? You got?
I turned 60 within 2 weeks.
Okay, you're the winner. That's a lot of you are familiar with, is an illustration from a study that came out last year, and you can see basically what it does. It's a diagram of parts of the brain that are communicating with other parts of the brain, and on the placebo side, you see that's an ordinary default state of consciousness, and then the psilocybin side, and how much more there is on the psilocybin side. Now, this is interesting, but what I find most fascinating about this is the move that I typically make is to look at something and say, this is a particular example of what higher class of things, what larger group of things. So if we look at this, we think, well, if psilocybin results in all this different pattern and more connections within the brain, what about, let's say, microdosing, or what about moderate dosing, or what about heavy dosing of LSD? But we don't have to limit ourselves to psychedelic chemicals. What about hypnosis, different types of meditation, transcranial brain stimulation? All these also would result in different patterns of the brain communicating with itself. And this is the big picture that I want us to look at for about the next 45 minutes, is that there's a whole new view of the human mind. I should put that new in quotation marks because a lot of people in here have already thought about it. But it's a way of looking at the human mind that's different from the way we usually look at it. Now, what I find particularly interesting about this is that this definition of intelligence is that when we increase the repertoire of mind states that we can use, this is one measure of intelligence. And so when we change the patterns of intercommunication within the brain, what we are doing is developing a new access to new types of intelligence. So just think about this with all these different mind-body psychotechnologies that we have. I call them mind apps. We'll talk about that in a minute. So what we're talking about is increasing human ability. In this case, this author is interested in intelligence, but it could be many of our other abilities that also change from one mind-body state to another. So what we're looking at here is a way of improving human cognitive and physical and emotional capacities. And psychedelics are just one of a whole bunch of ways of increasing the number of accesses and access we have to those particular types. Now, the point I want to make on this is that while we think about artificial intelligence, we tend to think of it as being a digital thing. But what is actually going on, and it's time we recognize it, is we're talking about a neuro-artificial intelligence. For example, somebody changing his or her mind-body state. I'll get to why I say mind-body state rather than consciousness in a couple of slides. This is a type of neuro-artificial intelligence. And psychedelics are one of the big, best known, and in the case of this conference, the type of switch that we're making is producing a new type of neuro-artificial intelligence. So in addition to the digital artificial intelligence, we have neuro-artificial intelligence. I like to look at this as fitting into a much larger framework. The first lowest level is where this conference basically is, and it's where it should be because it makes a good, solid scientific and practical foundation to psychedelics and to other mind-body psychotechnologies. And in this case, I think we look at psychedelics as being a medicine. The most astounding thing about psychedelics is when they produce mystical experiences, and people have experiences that they interpret as being important religiously or spiritually. And this moves us up to the use of psychedelics as entheogens. I like to reserve the use of the word entheogen for spiritual uses of psychedelics, not as a synonym for psychedelic. And we're getting some talk about this. My second talk this morning will be about the entheogenic use of psychedelics. What happens, though, is we start to look at spiritual things. We get questions of meaningfulness, what's rightness, an aesthetic sense, all these other things that are interested not just only to people in a spiritual community, but in the humanities in general. So in this afternoon, I want to give one example of using psychedelics as a way of, in the humanities, and I'll do that by interpreting Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs using Stan Groff's view of the human mind. It's a very rich way of psychocriticism, and I really recommend it. Finally, this morning, we'll get up to what I call the mind design stage. That is, we are not just given a mind that we have to explore and enhance a little bit, but we are actually in the process of mind design. And that is the big opening question And this is why I consider this the largest topic, the largest intellectual topic. I was going to say the largest psychedelic topic, definitely, but more than that, the largest intellectual topic. So in explaining to people this, I found it handy to use this little analogy. And once you use this analogy, you think very differently about the human mind, about psychedelics, about meditation, about hypnosis, and so forth. If there's any one thing you remember from my talks, this is the thing to remember. That just as we can install digital apps in our electronic devices, we can install mind apps in our minds. And that's what psychedelics do. They install a mind app. So look at it that way, and this is an example of the neuro artificial intelligence. There is not just psychedelics, the predominant mind app, but there are lots of others. And here are a whole bunch of others. The list just goes on page after page. For example, talking about meditation, well, there are lots of types of meditation. There are lots of types of relaxation, hypnosis, and so forth. So each of these is actually a family of mind apps, not just one. And just as when we talk about psychedelics, we don't mean only LSD or only MDMA or only anything else. We include the whole family. So each of these is a family, and when we realize these are all mind apps that we can install in our minds, suddenly our view of what the human mind is and can be just extends enormously. I find that this is the major stumbling block for people to understand this. People in this room don't make this assumption, but a lot of our colleagues and friends do, and that's that all good thinking takes place in our ordinary awake mind-body state. Now, obviously, this conference contradicts that, as do many other things, because we have good thinking in a therapeutic sense taking place with MDMA, psychedelics, ayahuasca, and so forth. I like to have an image of this. I call this the pie chart, and what this basically does is a visual presentation of the idea of a theory that includes all mind-body states and all mind apps. And over on the right, you see some of them listed there, but there are a lot. For example, dreaming, breathing techniques. There are tens, if not hundreds, of different breathing techniques, which are mind apps that we can install on our minds. Different types of yoga, different types of sensory overload and isolation. So what we're looking at here is a much larger and enormous view of the human mind. I think it's similar to like Western Europe suddenly discovering that there's Africa and that there's the Americas, and their view of the globe expands. Our view of the human mind is also expanding. I use the word mind-body state rather than state of consciousness, and that's in an attempt to become clear about what I'm talking about, because consciousness has so many different uses. I've gone to consciousness meetings and listened to people talk, and they're talking about very different things, but they're all using the word consciousness, so they think they're talking about the same thing. I'll give you an example. We are awake now. Last night we were asleep and unconscious, or she is conscious now and has come out of the coma. Or we can say, the spiritual experience raised so-and-so's spiritual consciousness. So there's a different use of the word consciousness. In political and social sciences, we talk about proletarian consciousness and women's consciousness. So there are all these different things. My favorite error on this is in the philosophy. When philosophers say consciousness, they usually mean self-reflectiveness. That is, you can think, and you can think about thinking. But that's very different when we're talking about a shift in mind-body state, or we're talking about being awake versus being asleep. So I like to use the word mind-body state, and I'm using Charlie Tart's idea of consciousness, but just calling it mind-body state, because it fits in better with talking about consciousness, because I'm talking about shifts in overall patterns of cognitive, emotional, and biological functioning at one time. That's what Charlie Tart used in his altered state of consciousness. Residence is a particularly interesting and very rich idea, and it leads to supporting the claim that this is the largest intellectual area. Again, A lot of these ideas are saying, yeah, of course, everybody recognizes that. But when you move the idea from an unconscious assumption to a conscious thought, you're able to use it and work on it and develop it rather than just sort of make an assumption. So basically it says everything we do is a function of our mind-body state. You know, our thinking, our emotions, our bodily processes are functions of, expressions of the mind-body state that we're in. Last night when we were asleep, we were in a different mind-body state, and those functions are working differently. And what psychedelics and other mind apps do is give us an additional way or ways of exploring the things that reside in those mind-body states. So basically this comes up with a very simple question that amplifies very quickly to a much broader one. This basically is what this conference is about. How does psychotherapy vary from our default mind-body state in psychedelic states? And most of the sessions will look at that question and be examples of that question. Well, we can broaden that question up to the next stage. How does blank, whatever you're interested in, vary from mind-body state to mind study? So we move just from psychedelics and psychotherapy into whatever you're interested in. And this is an opportunity for you to plug in whatever your favorite topic of or topics of interest are. So just plug them in there. And this results in a huge, vast quantity of questions. One of your handouts has this. Some of my handouts have a lot of words, and rather than just reading them to you, just read them on the handouts. And so this is just an example. You can plug into that. How does blank vary from mind-body state to mind-body state into problem solving? And Jin will be talking about microdosing, which is one of the approaches to problem solving. He also is one of the authors of the very famous study that came out in 1966 on using psychedelics with professionals for problem solving. So we could take any one of these topics and plug it in there. This is what I mean by a vast question. So let's take a look briefly at single-state theory. I was amazed when I first saw that hand move. On my computer, it doesn't move, and that really sort of surprised me. So the multi-state theory basically has a bunch of assumptions. One is the single-state fallacy. Right? We can use lots of mind-body states. We can produce and use lots of mind-body states by using mind apps. Resonance tells us that we can look at the various human abilities that are in those, and we'll get to mind design at the end of this talk. So I'm going to take a bit of time now and talk about examples of using this idea as a way of thinking about a couple ideas in science, the humanities, cognitive enhancement, and mind design. So we'll just take a few examples of this. These are some of my favorite ideas. In fact, one of my favorite. First, let's look at a couple in science. This is a very nice diagram from psychotherapy or psychopharmacology of LSD that came out a couple of years ago. And it just shows a lot of the topics that LSD enriches. But there are some more I think they've missed, and I want to talk about a few more. Let me talk about one of my two favorite, which is the idea of emergence of mind. Emergence is this absolutely fascinating process that when you put two or more things together, the result has characteristics that none of the original components did. And the most obvious is you take oxygen gas, hydrogen gas, put them together, and you get water. And you get all those watery qualities that neither gas has alone. So those qualities are spoken of as, quote, emerging. And one of the ways of looking at the human mind is, how does mind emerge from all this biological stuff up here, and the rest of our body? What process is going on there? Now, this is a fascinating one, but there isn't much research in this field. Well, no, there is some research in the field, but I think they're missing the point. If we drop down to the third line there, if we consider our brain and there's that pie diagram, all those mind apps, and when you put those into our brain, they will produce other mind-body states, and there will be additional processes of emergence. So the number of studies of emergence that we have just expands for every mind app that we use. And this is a way of trying to study a field, to get more samples of it. So we have more samples of mind emergence when we install mind apps into our brain. I'll say brain and mind interchangeably. Okay. So here we can do some research on emergence and try to find out mind emergence. How does that happen? And we can have hypnosis and all these types of meditation, breathing techniques, and so on and so forth, to try to understand this very puzzling project of emergence. Consilience is one of my other favorite ideas. The ant guy, the guy who studied ants, Edward Wilson, wrote a book called Consilience, and this is an idea that's been hanging around. It's one of the, along with emergence, these are like major league questions in science that are so major league that most people don't even bother addressing them. The idea is to thread together enough studies in, I would say the sciences, but also in the humanities, that weave together so that they make one large construction, one large structure. So here's the idea is a scaffolding of ideas. And at the bottom, of course, we have physics, and that out of that emerges chemistry and biology and psychology and the social sciences and the humanities. Now, something very nice about psychedelics is they are made to study this question of emergence, because there's all these joint fields, like biochemistry. And in fact, a lot of what this conference is about is looking at this question of consilience. When we look at it this way, we put a molecule in down at the biological level, and out comes concepts like portent. Portent is the feeling that something incredibly important is about to occur. A sense of truth. I think you've probably already had this experience. This is true. Boy, this is really true. Or the next one, this is real. This is realer than real. Okay. So truth, reality, sacredness, beauty, and goodness become areas that we can explore experimentally. By changing mind-body state, we can then see how these change from one mind-body state to another. So we can start to do some research on each one of these, and these are topics the humanities like to grab into. Meaningfulness, for example, reality, truth, portent. These are important for the humanities. So here we're moving from the basic molecules down in the lower left-hand level up to humanistic concerns over on the right side. So this is a way of developing experimental humanities. Humanities doesn't have to be just reading what somebody said and analyzing it or recording what some philosopher said a long time ago. But experimental philosophy, I think, is the big field that is just waiting to be developed. So we'll look at a couple humanities examples here. This is a list, I think you've got it on a handout, of some of the topics that have already been noticed but not fully explored in psychedelic scholarship. Those that I mentioned, like truth, reality up there on the top, but there's mind, open-mindedness, insights, ideas, meaningfulness. All these things are topics that now can be explored experimentally in the humanities. We don't have to just sort of think about something. We can actually do some research to change our experiences of those humanistic concepts. So this is another pitch here of the largeness of this idea. Okay, suddenly you've got the languages, literature, philosophy, all those things beginning to be experimental and being looked at from psychological perspective. There's another sneaker in this that I'll get to a little bit later. Another use of the humanities is as psychocriticism. Psychocriticism is using ideas from psychology to understand culture, art, music. The best known, of course, is everybody knows Freudian analysis, and there's Jungian analysis. This afternoon I'll be giving an example of Graphian analysis as one example of using psychedelics in the humanities to interpret things. Another example comes from Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero with 1,000 faces. We'll touch on that this afternoon. what Campbell said is that if you look at the major legends, myths, religions, the stories that persist generation through generation in culture after culture, you find one story constantly emerging, which he calls the hero. Okay, the hero's story. The Star Wars series, by the way, is based on Campbell's work. And so I'm proposing that now here in the 20th and 21st century, we have a new version of the hero. And this is the consciousness explorer. And it might be Ram Dass, it might be Leary, it might be Jim Fadiman, it might be the people that we think of as, quote, the elders. And it's probably a lot of people, probably almost everybody in this room would qualify as a hero exploring, in this case, his or her human mind and trying to make sense out of that. And an important thing about the hero is that he or she brings back something of value to society. It's not just going in and fighting the dragon to kill the dragon, but to take the dragon's gold back and distribute it in society. So I think we have a reincarnation of the hero myth, and our hero myth is the consciousness explorer. I want to say a few words about cognitive enhancement. The usual approach of cognitive enhancement is a good one and should definitely be followed, but I want to talk about some that multistate theory brings up that I think deserve to be followed. There are plenty of examples of people using psychedelics for practical problem-solving use. For example, Carrie Mullis developed the PCR technique, not on psychedelics, but taking a psychedelic, he learned to visualize. And this is very interesting. He took the skill of visualizing from a psychedelic state and transferred it back to his ordinary awake state. And one of the big problems is the transfer of information from one state to another. Probably everybody in this room has had the experience, some morning waking up and knowing you had a dream, you can't remember the dream, and then suddenly, for me it's around 10:30, the whole thing downloads and you remember it. So that memory is in there, and can we access that particular memory? One of the most intriguing things that's going on has to do with the savant syndrome. There are some very curious cases of people with sort of ordinary lives that have had some extreme experience, and they've developed savant syndrome, and they've been able to function. Now, the idea is that savants may be tapping into a level of information processing below what we usually think of. Our brains sort of take in this information in very, very sort of primitive perceptual things and put them together and pack these pieces together until finally we come up with a concept. And then maybe savants are able to tune in. And the question is, could we all learn to be the savants? I don't want to be the person who gets hit over the head with a baseball bat and becomes a savant, but there must be some good ways of studying this. Bob Wallace, poor Bob Wallace, he joined Microsoft, and this little insignificant, little scratchy company trying to meet their payroll, and they couldn't make their payroll, so they gave people stock. Okay, early, and Bob was one of the, I think it was like the 8th or 9th person to work for Microsoft and get stock, which turned out to be a large part of Microsoft. Well, he was very interested in mind-body states and left his job at Microsoft. He invented shareware. You know, when computers were first starting out, there were lots of languages, and everybody wanted everybody else to use their language. So there's a problem called shelf space. You know, you go to the store and you want to buy cereal, and suddenly like 10,000 types of cereal, and the same thing was going on with languages. And people are always trying to promote their language. So Bob said, let's give it away, and we'll ask people to pay for it. Well, that seemed like not a very sound business proposition, but they gave it away, and lots of people used it. And enough people used it so that they made money. And then, because so many people used it, it became the standard in the field. See? So they gave it away, it became the standard in the field, and that's how Microsoft got. And he had this idea, tripping. Professional problem solving, well, Jim is the person to answer that, talk about that. He was part of that study done in '66. And psychotherapy, of course, is an example of a practical example, only an emotional social adjustment problem. So I want to look at 3 brief types of cognitive enhancement, strengthening current skills and processes. That's what's going on now. Okay, proposing paradigms, inventing hypotheses and ideas. Now this is a fascinating one, and the third one is inventing new mind-body processes. Benny Shannon, the author of this book, is a cognitive psychologist from Hebrew University, and he went on vacation to Brazil and tried some ayahuasca. Well, being a cognitive psychologist, he immediately said, "What is going on here? This doesn't fit in with what I thought I knew about cognitive psychology." So he did a very good study. He interviewed North Americans, Europeans, and Brazilians who'd done ayahuasca. He did quite a few trips himself, and he basically looked at this question of how can cognitive psychology be enriched by looking at, in his case, ayahuasca, and how can ayahuasca studies be enriched by bringing the information of cognitive psychology. So he blended these two fields in this book called Antipodes of the Mind. If I were going to teach a graduate course and I wanted my students to see how good a study might be on psychedelics, I'd have them read this book as a very good case method of how to combine whatever it is you're interested in with psychedelics. And Benny did a beautiful job of combining this. Now what I consider the big one, the really big one, mind design. Okay, let's go back to take a look at our pie chart here. And in looking at the items on the column on the right-hand side and all their subcategories and things that are left out of this, this is just to get across an idea, by no means is it complete. We can see these not just as ways of enriching our minds the way they are, but as ways of producing new mind-body states to install in our minds, states that have not been created yet. See, this is the big idea. Most research in psychedelics, for example, the people who are the subjects take ayahuasca or LSD or MDMA or so forth, okay. So this is a very nice idea, and there's a lot to study here, and this conference is largely about that. But there's a larger view, and the larger view is what happens if we take these various items on the right-hand side and consider them as ingredients. As in cooking, there are lots of ingredients. You can put them together in lots of different ways. I like to use the simile of minestrone soup. There's no one set, excuse me if your family disagrees with this, there's no one set recipe for minestrone soup. You might have, more of this and less of this, and depending on the season, whatever it is. Well, the ingredients can be put together in any number of different ways, and these ingredients, that is, the mind apps, can be combined in different ways, and we come up with this possible thing. This, on the top, this is called magnetic brain stimulation. It's some interesting work that's being done largely with depression and anxiety, in which a powerful magnetic field is applied outside the skull to various parts of the brain. So let's say that's one of our ingredients. Let's say the second ingredient is whatever your favorite pill is. What happens when you put those together? You've just invented, you've constructed a new mind-body state. What are its abilities? Okay. What are its possibilities? You see, all the questions that we now ask, let's say cognitive psychology is the hot field now in psychology. All the questions we now ask in cognitive psychology, we now re-ask for every other mind-body state, and then we produce mind-body states that have never been made before and ask them again. You see what I mean by these big questions? And down at the bottom is that generalized, take these various ingredients from the pie chart and put them together, and you produce mind-body states that have never been produced before. That is the big question. I call it the gigantic question. So, let's go back to this scaffolding of ideas. When we look at the scaffolding of ideas from this perspective, we can invent mind-body states that will have implications for every one of these different levels. And each one of these levels will, in turn, have something to look back at the mind-body state and have its insights into it. So this is what I think is really the gigantic question. I want to get back to this big idea now. So in addition to digital artificial intelligence, we are now making, although we are just beginning to realize it, neuro-artificial intelligence, in which our brains, our bodies, are the base of developing these new states. And this conference is an early conference, and so I hope will eventually turn out to be neuro-artificial intelligence, because that field needs to be developed just as systematically as digital artificial intelligence. In that diagram of how different levels of psychedelic thinking fit together, I had one idea called ideogens, and I think this is another use of psychedelics. In addition to medicines and entheogens, they are ideogens. That is, they generate ideas. And now when we use that very almost obvious word, this interests people who are interested in ideas in psychedelics. It's not just weird experiences, and music is not just more wonderful than it's ever been before, but it's a way of generating ideas that have not been thought before. So psychedelics provide research variables. We have experimental humanities, interpretive frameworks, as with Groff, multistate theory, mind apps, residency, the central multi-state question, that's the how does blank vary from mind-body state. That's the multi-state question. And possibility of developing new paradigms and new insights. So when these are put together, they meet Kuhn's qualifications of a paradigm. A word that was well used, terribly overused, and now I think underused. And one of your handouts lists these, so I won't bother reading them to you. And if you'd like to see the slides, they're on my website, along with a bunch of other slides and papers and so forth. So, and you're welcome to copy them, use them, whatever you'd like to do. Okay, questions, comments, observations? Oh, Jim has something to say. Would you say something about questions?
Yeah, we're going to have questions after each of our
Right.
one.
Okay, well, I'm ready.
So hold questions for now.
Okay, hold questions. Jim, you ready to go?
I'm on. Okay. I don't need it. I mean, I don't have a PowerPoint.
Just tell people to use their imagination.
Okay. Phew. When Tom started, I had that, that feeling you get when everything actually is exactly as it should be? And I thought, whoa, Tom and I have collaborated closely on the way these talks are going to work, which is true, but not at a level of consciousness. So what I'd like to share with you, and I also have a PowerPoint presentation, but it didn't work. But I didn't think it would work. And so I can tell you what's on the PowerPoints. The first one says maps. Psychedelic science. And the second one, which is what I'm going to talk about, has the title of Healthy Multiplicity, Towards More Accurate Perception of Yourself and Others. And it's taking a totally different way of slicing the mind-body state question. And just a little bit of context, psychedelics don't get all the credit they deserve in a lot of areas. For example, almost all of neuroscience and neurochemistry arose as a field of interest because of an interest in serotonin, and serotonin became of interest because it's like the LSD molecule. So literally, LSD opened up the notion that the brain was busy chemically. And some of you are old enough to remember when we all knew what really happened in the brain was electrical, and that there wasn't a word about chemistry. So hooray for our side. Now, in the MAPS manual that's for training therapists, and are some of you in those trainings? Hands, please. Right. Part of your manual for the phase 3 study for MDMA to alleviate the suffering of people with PTSD is there's a need to accept and work with multiplicity, with participants' selves, plural, and not to diminish, subdue, eviscerate, fuse, or eliminate any of those selves. It's to accept, nourish, heal, and improve the health of each self, and to encourage cooperation and harmony. Does that fit in with what you've been trained? Now, what I want to talk about is if multiplicity might be a better way to consider how each and every one of us is constructed. If that in itself is beneficial, just that notion. So, basic notion to look at, which there's an usually unstated, culturally unexamined assumption in Western thought, Western religion, Western philosophy, Western psychology, and Western science, that each one of us is a single, unified self. Now, this may relate to the notion that there's monotheism or vice versa. But in any case, that's out there, and most people act as if that were so. I think it's what you call the single-state fallacy. Middendorfer is really suggesting something different for people with PTSD. And this is a little quote from the MAPS bulletin describing that, and I want us to keep in mind what he's saying. The treatment manual describes the importance of validating and exploring experiences of multiplicity. At one level, these different self-images represent the psyche's way of adapting in order to contain experience that's overwhelming. In many cases, these adaptations are necessary for psychological survival. Okay, so this is working with that particular population and a theory of why these selves emerge, which is they emerge because they're helpful. Now, if they emerge in people with PTSD, what that would mean, using this wonderful term, emergence of selves, is a natural capacity of human beings. Okay? Now, it also may be a natural capacity of other animals. Think about those of you who have dogs or cats. I don't know about gerbils and other things. And whether they seem to have rather different points of view, quite rapidly shifting. And then we'll go back to you in a moment. Now, one of the reasons in the manual it suggests that they use music, it can be particularly effective in the way participants can have the opportunity to dialogue with different parts of the self. The ones that carry the experience of trauma, the warriors, the protectors, the nurturers. Working with multiplicity also provides room for spiritual and archetypical realms of experience. Important aspect of healing, once the connection to the multiplicity within may pave the way for connection with the outer community to begin regeneration. So that's a summary of a part of the manual. And let me give you a data point. So I'm weak on theory, but I'm big on examples, which lets, because theories people argue about. I like to have examples that people argue about. PowerPoint. Timmy loves orange juice, and a picture of an orange juice glass. PowerPoint's just great. Timmy is 11. When Timmy drinks orange juice, he has no problem. But Timmy is just one of close to a dozen personalities who alternate control over him. And if those other personalities drink orange juice, the result is a case of hives. The hives will occur even if Timmy drinks orange juice and another personality appears while the orange juice is still being digested. What's more, if Timmy comes back when the allergic reaction is present, the itching of the hives will cease immediately and the water-filled blisters will begin to subside. Okay? What's going on? Well, what I find for many people, not I think for you guys, a lot of people say, well, that's not true. And then I have to say, New York Times. But then, of course, we know that's not true. But it was written by Danny Goleman, and that's true. So there's something going on which is quite extraordinary and extreme physiologically when there's a change in self, at least in Timmy. Now, by the way, the being of which Timmy is a member is in its 30s. So Timmy happens to be 11, but there are adult personalities as well. Now, let's put that aside because that's extreme and psychopathological and weird, and it hasn't happened to you. Let's talk about you. Have you ever argued with yourself? Who are you arguing with? Who is the other voice? Or other voices? When looking at the last cookie or piece of cake, who says yes? And who says no? Have you ever been by yourself or with your old friends and done something really wild and crazy? Something you'd never do around your parents, your children, your coworkers? Who acted wild and crazy? Was that the same you that was embarrassed later on? See, that's an interesting question, which is who reflects on behavior that seems to be not related to that part of you. Have you ever been so stressed that you did something that you told yourself you would never do? And once you did it, or even while you were doing it, did another part of you already say, you're making a big mistake? Okay? Anyone who has not had any of those feelings, raise your hand. Okay? So here we are. How about this one? I don't know what got into me. How different are you when you're at a job interview with your parents, with your kids? There was a time when I was visiting my mother, and it was not good. And I said to my stepfather, you can see how charming I was, how do you live with her? He said, she's only like this when you're around. Oh. Have you ever been so furious that you lost it? And I was looking at that particular state of mind of fury. And then someone reminded me that one of the great psychologists, Sophocles, wrote a play around 440 BC called Ajax. And in that play, Ajax loses his best friend Achilles, and he is not given Achilles' armor. and he loses it. And he turns on, this is Trojan War, he turns on Odysseus and the other generals in what we use the term blind fury. And Athena clouds his vision, so he sees the captured animals that they've acquired as people, and he kills a huge number of them. And then, at some point, surrounded by bloody corpses of animals who he thinks are people, he comes to himself. And he deals with the question of, what do I now do with my life? I have done this terrible thing, because everyone's really mad at him for killing all their animals. And he says, the Trojans, my enemies, all hate me. The Greeks all hate me. Everybody hates me. I could go home. I could get in my boat and go back to Greece, but what would I say to my father? And he commits suicide, because he cannot reconcile what he has done and who he believes himself to be, who is a great hero. And I thought, oh, ancient Greece. Now, was it yesterday or the day before, the guy who killed a random stranger and then showed it on Facebook? And when he was found out, when he was simply noticed by, I think, a guy in a burger joint, he committed suicide. So the problem of what do you do, and he says, this whoever this guy was, he says, I lost it. Okay, whatever it was. So what Sophocles is talking about turns out to be exactly what we're still dealing with. Have you ever been in a different state when you've been terrified, meaning you behaved quite differently? Now, I'm saying this with a question mark, but have you ever been in a different state when you've been sexually aroused? The question mark, I think, is superfluous. How about the difference between you being stone cold sober, drunk, stoned, tripping balls? Who is those people? And let me just ask about an easier question. How many of you are bilingual? Okay, can I just have a couple of language sets? Yes, please. Say it louder. Spanish and English. Another? Russian and English. Okay. So, question for the bilingual. When you shift languages, are there other shifts? A shift in, by the way, is there a shift in your speech pattern? Did you have a different, do you speak actually, does your pitch go up or down? And there are other changes. Now, there's a different kind of bilingual, which I've only seen in Canada, in Quebec, where in the same sentence, the best word in each language is used. I suspect that level of bilingual doesn't show those changes, because that's really one larger language. But for those of you who make the shift, it is quite different. And again, very much unstudied. So the question that I think you're seeing I have an opinion on is, might you be a well-functioning multiple inside a single body? And the basic assumptions that come out of saying maybe that's so is healthy, normal people have more than one self. And different selves are different. They differ in values, they differ in vocabulary, they differ in posture. Have you ever, for instance, danced the MDA night away? And who did that? Voice and speech patterns are different in different cells, and worldviews are different. B.F. Skinner, who I love to mention because we never mention him, wrote very slowly all his zillion papers, but he would be glad if he could get about 100 words a day. Except once in his life when he wrote a novel, Walden 2, which is about a behaviorist, an ideally behaviorist community, a commune. Wrote it in 6 weeks, a novel. Never happened again. And if you read Skinner's papers and you read the novel, the idea that the same guy wrote them would never occur to you. And he should have stayed with papers for some of us. But it did sell about 2 million copies, which was not true of his papers in the journal of. So one of the things about multiplicity is it gets more apparent when you're looking for it. And the obviousness of the prepared mind. I used to teach at Stanford in design engineering. And one of the assignments that my students had was to take a shape walk, which is they were to take a walk somewhere, and they were on the way out on this walk, they were to look for circles and ovals. And on the way back, they were to look for squares and rectangles. And what they reported with amazement is how could they have missed all the squares and rectangles on the way out? How could they were absolutely not invisible, but amazed to them how it popped out. So again, if you're not looking for it, it's harder to see it. And I think you may remember the wonderful story of the indigenous people who are visited by a Spanish galleon, this huge ship in the harbor, and the Spanish come off and come to shore and do all the bad things they did. And the natives couldn't see the ship. They said, "How did you get here?" Because it wasn't conceivable that something like a Spanish galleon could exist. Okay? Now, I'm working on this with a friend, Jordan Gruber. We're actually writing a book in this area. And we were astonished and then delighted how much evidence we could find when we started looking. And the easiest place to look, of course, was pathology, because there's more written. And pathology I now define as an extreme of some normal behavior. PowerPoint coming up. A Thurber cartoon shows a woman on a couch and a man with a beard leaning towards her in, as best Thurber could draw it, a lascivious way. "You destroy the scientist in me, Miss Blair, and bring out the man." Psychopathology of lust. Now, when you get into some of the well-described multiples, the capacities are so different. Probably the most well-described, written by a beautiful writer, was called The Many Lives of Billy Milligan. And Billy Milligan was in a mental hospital, and he was also on trial for rape. And his defense was that he didn't do it. One of his other selves did it. And this case, actually, he won that case, but he was still in the mental hospital. And it turned out that among his multiples were ones with, one had enormous strength. In a different prison setting, he tore the sink off the wall and also could break out of a straitjacket. There were two of the people in Billy Milligan's world who were artists. One only did landscapes, had a whole trauma around people. The other only did portraits. And in the mental hospital, he was selling all his work until the state found out that he was selling all his work and said, "We have a rule that you mental patients can't sell their work." It's a fascinating book because there are levels of sophistication in Billy. There's one of his selves speaks a different language, knows a language that the others don't. And what Billy Milligan does not too well, but in many cases, he knows which is the most useful self for the situation. And another book you may have heard of called When Rabbit Howls, which is a person with many personalities, which includes, by the way, a teacher that all the other personalities respect, and who, when pressed, says, well, actually, I'm not part of the personality. I'm just here to help. And that's never quite explained in this book. This is a book written between the therapist and it's called, the author is called The Troops of Trudy Chase. And if you look at the frontispiece of the book, there's about 12 different handwritings, which are written by various members of her troupe. And unfortunately, this is the only PowerPoint that I would like you to have seen, but it's Kathy, the cartoon. And Kathy's mother is saying, "Sorry I sounded off about Harold, Kathy. I was being the noisy, hysterical me." "And now, Mom?" Second panel. "Oh, now I'm being the strangely cheerful me." Third panel. "Ready to hop on stage with no warning are the guilt master me, loving me, the smothering me, the stern me, the silly me, the pensive me, and the berserk me." And then it shows them holding each other, with the mother having a thought, "We annoy them, but no one can say we bore them." So Kathy really catches it, which is there's a set of possibilities that each of us have. And I'm asking you only to end up thinking about yourself, which I know is not hard to ask. Because what are the benefits? What are the benefits of thinking more clearly about multiplicity, of looking for the multiplicity on that walk? The first thing that happens is the world makes more sense, since it looks like that is the way it is. And when you begin to accept that in yourself and appreciate yourselves, these kind of more specialized areas of expertise and capacity, one of the things that happens is you're more forgiving of yourself. And the wonderful thing is it changes your relationships, because you no longer are assuming or demanding consistency in someone else. "How could you have done that?" "I didn't do that." "I did that." "Oh, you're just like me." Okay, and is there anyone who harmed you in your life once and you said, "I'm cutting them out of my life"? No. Except when I have to see them at Thanksgiving and at weddings. It's that person who behaved truly horribly, like Ajax. But if you realize that the rest of them might be just fine, it will shift the way you treat them. And you will shift the way you treat yourself. You end up, obviously, as we know, when you let go of any distortion in reality, you get extra energy. And when you are more aware of yourselves, you get more access to your own skills and creativity. So this is about making your world wiser and more harmonious, and as Mindorfer says in the manual, so that your parts can begin to support each other as well as accept each other. And when you, and I want to look at a single person. How many of you know who Herschel Walker is? Okay, Herschel Walker, PowerPoint, shows a very relaxed guy on the cover of his biography called Breaking Free, and then it shows him in his late 40s, and he is so buff and so muscled and kind of so over the top attractive. And he was an all-American college track star, had a world record. College running back, he was a 3-time All-American, set all kinds of records and won the Heisman Trophy. He was one of the NFL's premier running backs. He got an Olympic bronze medal in 1992 for bobsled. And when he went into professional mixed martial arts, he had no losses. Okay, but that's all kind of physical. He also danced for the Fort Worth Ballet. Not often. He was the winner on season 3 of the Celebrity Cook-Off. I should mention he was also on The Apprentice, but I don't want to mention that. But he founded and successfully ran one of the largest owned minority owned meat processing plants in the United States. And as a 12-year-old boy, he was fat and unpopular. And someone suggested to him that he should exercise. And he became, one of the world's great athletes. And a fine businessman and, a lot of other things. And what Herschel says is what made me different and what characterized my distinct form of mind was that for the majority of my life, the alternate personalities that I developed did more good than harm. Now, Herschel also did not go unscathed through life. He had a breakdown. He was driving to the house of a friend who, quote, was messing up his schedule, unquote, over the delivery of a new car. A murderous rage had come over Herschel, we're getting used to those, who found himself with the following internal dialogue. Every few seconds, I'd hear a voice telling me, "No, Herschel, that's wrong. You can't shoot a man down in cold blood over this." Over that voice, I'd hear another urging me on. "You got to take care of business. The guy has done you wrong. You can't let him get away with that. Kill him." Over and over, these two voices were shouting at me, each one pleading with me. "Do it. Stop it. Do it. You can't. Do it." Like the pulsing rhythm of a chorus, the two voices kept up a relentless beat. Now, we know this story because he did not kill the guy. What he did do was go into therapy. And his biography is based on why he went into therapy. And the people with that kind of what he called dissociation can be helped. Now, what it brings up is one of the shifts in perception is what is mental health. And I'll give you a working definition, which is partly mental health is being in the right mind at the right time. Okay? Or in their best self for the situation at hand. PowerPoint. I used to tell people I got most of my philosophy from musicals, but now I've matured, it's now cartoons. Dilbert. This is between Dilbert and Tina. Tina's got the large black hair. "Tina, why did you call me a flaming..." "I'm so sorry. That was my email personality. My real-time personality is kind and gentle." "Oh, okay," says Dilbert. And she is writing, "Never speak to me again, you miserable clump of decaying compost." So, what's the right mind at the right time? Let me give you an example that has a different kind of impact. Alcoholics Anonymous is a remarkable organization. worldwide. As you probably know, and as most AA members don't, Bill Wilson came to the realization by a drug-induced illumination. And by the way, later on when he was introduced to LSD, he said, oh, LSD should be made available to every group of AA people. And the board of directors of AA said, I don't think so. That would scare us all to death. And this was while LSD was still legal. So the problem with alcoholism, how many of you are psychotherapists? Okay. The success rate of working with alcoholics is about 5%. Of all the methods to help alcoholics, psychotherapy is the lowest. Why? It's possibility. The wrong person shows up. If you think about it, and if you've ever been drunk enough to think about it, the person the next morning wakes up, has a hangover, and feels bad about being drunk. However, that isn't the person that got drunk. And one of the ways you know that is the next possible time, if you're a serious alcoholic, when there's an opportunity to get drunk, you get drunk. And the person who gets drunk never gets a hangover and has no guilt. Except that alcohol's terrible for you, it's a great system. So who goes to therapy? The person who feels guilt and shame and regret. And the alcoholic, however, doesn't show up in therapy and nothing happens. Now, if you go to an AA meeting, how many of you have ever been to an AA meeting? Okay. I mean, they're wonderful. But they're very carefully designed to keep the alcoholic personality as the person who attends. There's a strong incentive. If you tell your story, which you do, you can't tell it as if it happened to someone else. You get no points from everyone in the room. But you tell your story, and then of course your story is topped by people whose lives were infinitely worse than yours and are now sober. And that's the kind of message. But what keeps AA functioning is that it's the alcoholic self who shows up. And what you get from that is you begin to get that you can shift. And this is again what Tom talked about. Shifting is a conscious act. How do you get from one self to another, especially when you know that you're about to use the wrong self for the wrong thing? Have any of you ever, with your spouse or significant other, not said that? What you knew was absolutely true because you're absolutely right, but you know if you say that, you're going to hear it for the next 10 years. And you don't say it, okay? Or you did say it and you've heard it for the next 10 years. You know those. And we have in the culture, lots of ways. The one that you heard as a child and it never made any sense at all, count to 10. Count to 10? I want to punch little Albert out right now because he just broke my something. Why would counting to 10 give me anything but more strength? And the answer is, it might shift you. And as an adult, we now call it mindfulness, and we say, just sit quietly and do your breathing, or pant, as in holotropic breath work. Other ways that you know that shift you. Take a walk. Go work in your garden. Weeding and pruning are actually different kinds of centering practices. Write a letter that you don't intend to send. Do not write an email to your ex when drunk. We know that one. I know I shouldn't make this call. And you're right. Again, if I go back to my early philosophy training, South Pacific, I'm going to wash that man right out of my hair and send him on his way, right? Substances are used to help people shift cells. Tobacco, alcohol. I'm just not myself until I have a cup of coffee in the morning. Who are you? Well, I'm a lousier version. And the one that after I drink coffee, this lovely person emerges. You ever use change your cells with cannabis? It's one of its uses. I'm just going to mellow out. Psychiatric meds. What are purpose of most psychiatric meds are, they say they're mood changers, but what they're really trying to do is self-changers. And, as you know, they're not, a huge percentage of people, they're not effective. I'll cover that when we get to microdosing. Then there's one of the new methods, used to be in my day, it was called go to India. Now it's called go to Peru. Why do people take psychedelics? One of the reasons is to get in touch with other states. PowerPoint cartoon. This is Ballard Street. She is saying to him, he's sitting in an armchair looking away and kind of sour. And to whom am I speaking? Mr. Pleasant Person or Mr. Crabby Icky Man? The cartoon suggests it's Crabby Icky Man. And all I'm suggesting to you, and just while you're here for the next few days, which is, like in a cocoon with people who think you're wonderful just because you're part of them, it looks like awareness of healthy diversity and multiplicity in yourself leads to, with very little effort, just noticing, increased energy, increased creativity, and more effective, harmonious, and loving relationships. I'd like to leave you with that. And if I had my PowerPoint, I would give you a Thurber cartoon. He's sitting in a chair, a little nasty. She's sitting in a chair opposite him. These very simple line drawings. And she's angry. And she says, "Which you am I talking to now?" And I suggest in your relationships, that's a good question. Which you am I talking to you now? And the other question, of course, is which you just asked that question. So I'd like you to carry that with you. And I think our schedule says we're taking a break. Is that what it says? Schedule, please, Natalie? Hello. Are we taking a break now? Can you relay that message up here? Yes. Okay, what we're going to do, we're taking a 15-minute break, and then we're coming back, and then Tom and I will both be doing questions on the morning presentation. Have a good break.